Hello everyone, this is update for August 3, 2024, day 892 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up for all those days that I was absent, sorry for that, some personal time off. I'm gonna do quick walkthrough the macroeconomic update, and then I'm gonna switch to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, which is getting worse by day, as everybody who is following probably aware of that. So first, let's just look quickly what's going on economy-wise in the world, and we're gonna start with the U.S. Quick update on the U.S. government debt. As mentioned, it was about to cross over 35 trillion. It did, so it's moving forward, as I say. At the same time, U.S. Federal Reserve kept the interest rate at 5.5%. Didn't change, probably heading to first rate cut in September. The job market in the US is clearly, let's say, becoming weaker. There's no huge sort of cratering at the same time, but it's definitely kind of like fell and then at new sort of low. At the same time, it's not totally painful yet. So the first number is ADP. This is largest payment processor, basically salary payment processor in US. It's showing that US private companies created fewer jobs than the prior period, as you can imagine. So it's becoming very clear that job creation is going in, declining, which is obviously not a positive sign. Continuing jobless claim remain elevated. They grew in the prior period, as you can see, and they remain more or less there. No new spike in initial jobless claims. They actually even went down for non-seasonal adjusted. So things kind of like, as I said, worsened, and then they kind of remain frozen in that state, and there is no acceleration in the worsening of the condition. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to explain in a short. But it's very clear that U.S. economy is moving into sort of negative direction. Now let's switch to China. There are some numbers from there. So first of all, foreign direct investment, they remains negative, which is, I guess, not surprise for anyone. Basically, all foreign investors, Western companies, are trying to pull out if they can. It's not always possible. Most of the time, China is the best alternative out there. It has pretty strong its own strong advantages, but at the same time, everybody's who can tries to pull out. So things remain sort of stable in negative way for China. Then Chinese Federation of Logistics provided its PMI number, which shows that manufacturing, which is manufacturing mentioned before many times, is for China, is basically essence of China. No surprise to anyone. And that's where China as society generates its value add and its profits in other way. And as you can see, it remains in a negative territory. So below 50 means shrinking or decline in manufacturing. So it's not worsening, it's just sort of chronically negative, but at the same time, things don't get worse. So sort of similar to US, where they getting worse, but they not radically getting worse. And similar situation here as well. So basically, China remains in this chronic negative condition, but it's not terrible negative condition. So it's kind of like a mild negative situation. Now let's move to Europe, and here, if we look at GDP numbers, it's we almost kind of see two opposites. One is Germany, where GDP is declining consecutively most of the time. Again, result of the war on conventional energy. This is the main driver of what's going on in Germany. And then on the other hand, on the other opposite is France, where the GDP is still positive, still growing, even though the growth is clearly declining. But overall, Europe managed to pull a positive number, even actually it grew a little bit. Obviously, Germany was net negative there, but other countries such as France and Italy managed to pull it up. At the same time, unemployment in Germany is not spiking. As you can see, it's more or less stable at 6%, which is actually surprising given this GDP numbers. But this is what it is. Then CPI inflation in Europe remains more or less stable, elevated, higher than sort of typical goal of central banks, which is roughly 2%. There's no really scientific logic there. It's more driven by the desire to support asset inflation, and that's really what the driver that allows then refinancing of those assets and sort of rolling of the debt, and that's really the driver for that 2%. Now let's finish with Japan. Actually, situation is in Japan is in some ways actually opposite to the to Europe, US, where unemployment actually going down. So basically, situation in the economy, you can say, somewhat improving, and Japanese central bank, or Bank of Japan, even increased interest rate. As you can see, interest rate were near zero for a really long time in Japan, and it's moving it to 0.5%. It's almost I'd say earth-shattering event for Japan. What this also means is that Japanese investors, which were typically what they would do, they would send their capital outside of Japan, because in Japan it earns zero, which is nothing. So they would send it abroad, and now that this increasing this interest rate will increase repatriation of Japanese capital back home, where there is better condition for it. It doesn't mean it's not radical, but especially when the U.S. central bank will start reducing its interest rates, and Bank of Japan still gonna sort of keep it where it is, or maybe even go up. The flow of capital from most actually from the U.S., because that's where Japanese capital goes. That will actually may support higher interest rates in the U.S., at least the long dated part. So what we may see in U.S., it might be steepening of the curve, because right now it's inverted, which means where the shorter date debt is higher than the longer dated debt. So basically, if you borrow for 1 year, you pay high interest rate, versus you would borrow for 10 years, which I think logically does not make sense, because if you borrow for 10 years, there is more uncertainty, so you should pay probably more. and then obviously for 1 year there is more certainty, so you should pay less. So this is almost the situation is on its head, which is negative side for the economy, because that really means that banks cannot function in such environment, because they need the short-term rates to be lower than the long-dated rates, because that's what they really do. They basically intermediary that borrows money from regular people at short-term for short-term, and then turns around and lends it for the long period of time, and they earn the difference. Basically, they arbitrage time, and that's really what the banks do everywhere. And what's going on right now is that they cannot arbitrage time, so that's really breaking banking system from within. And obviously, banking system, the way the world functions, with debt-based money, non-functioning banking system means that the money, it's not really money, but the currency cannot function properly. It's basically like self-destroying the whole idea of the debt-based economy. So now let's switch to Ukraine. So one update for Ukraine, that Ukraine got F-16. There are, I think, 6 of those, and that's obviously not going to change anything. Obviously, it's net positive for Ukraine. There is no question about it. But 6 airplane not going to change anything. And even when Ukraine gets whatever 20, 40, 50, it's still not going to change situation in a meaningful way. It definitely will increase losses for Russia. There's no question about it, but it's not going to be a game changer. Probably the best way to describe it. Then, in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, there is rising resistance to mobilization among the population, to the point that there was basically like a demonstration. People's demonstrations were very like sort of random in this town called Koval here, where I'm showing, where basically people stormed mobilization point and freed up from there some people who were freshly mobilized. This is obviously becoming more and more clear that there is not enough people who are motivated, who have reason to fight for Ukraine as a system, as a government, as society, and that's really highlights the whole problem that Ukraine needs to change, or it will die, and no amount of Western help will save Ukraine. Because Russia is clearly indicated that it's not willing to negotiate, and Russia is clearly sensing that Ukraine right now is getting into strategically absolutely disastrous situation. So there is no even incentive to have negotiations, because Russia is seeing the situation as a perfect situation to capture most of Ukraine, if not all. If possible, all, that's going to be great. If not, if Russia can capture majority of Ukraine, that's great, good enough for now. I'm sure that Russia eventually will continue. There is no question about it. But the real solution for Ukraine is it needs to open its border, let people sort of go who don't want, and change for better as society too, so that people who or in Ukraine who want to come back to Ukraine have a reason to do that. Because right now, what Ukrainian government is proposing, they decided to increase taxes tremendously, which is already economy is essentially non-existing, dead, and it's almost like you try to milk that cow. That's just absolute nonsense. It highlights the intellectual inability of Ukrainian president and his group to really to find a solution, to find vision or strategy for Ukraine how to win the war. Because really, this winning this war is not about Western help. It's really about Ukraine as society changing for better. And that's the essence of it. And if Ukraine is not going to be able to do it or not going to figure out, it will cease to exist. And as I said, no amount of Western help will help us that. And in the process, Ukraine will have its 1917 moment. It's coming closer, and it's just a question if it's going to go in a negative direction or in a positive direction. Which by positive meaning society changing for better, or society decided to just continue the path and eventually will fail. So that's in a nutshell internal situation in Ukraine. Now let's do a walk through the front line in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do. So the situation along the front line, along the state border, remains stable without major changes all the way up to Kharkiv. Northeast of Kharkiv, things are essentially also frozen. As I mentioned before, situation stalled. Neither side has resources to achieve their goals. Now let's move at the situation on the North Lugansk front line. There is relatively reduced Russian activity, some push towards Kupiansk, and then also pressure in the southern part of it, around Terny, Makiyivka. At the same time, there are no major advances by Russian forces. Now let's look at the situation on the North Donbass front line. Things here somewhat similar. Russian pressure around with the idea of capturing Siversky. There's no no-brainer here. Fairly primitive, fairly straightforward. As I mentioned before, Russian forces did have some success in the past here. They captured village Razdolivka, but at the same time, situation relatively contained, relatively under control for Ukrainian forces. Now let's move south a little bit. Situation near Chasiv Yar or west of Bakhmut, slowly moving in a negative direction for Ukrainian forces. So first of all, Russian troops crossed this fresh river channel, which long time ago they did it. Then they were counterattacked, pushed back. Now they back. And they slowly moving. It's north of Chasiv Yar. Basically, it seems that Russian command opted for primitive frontal squeeze without even trying to build northern and southern pincer. It might be that they don't have enough resources here, so they're just trying to do at least something. Basically, I would describe this as Russian, whoever is commander here is basically trying to paint the picture to Russian political top that they're still advancing here, that there is some positive developments from Russian perspective, but they essentially the worst approach Russia can have here. Also, Ukrainian forces in process of losing Klischiyivka, so it's essentially done deal. Probably another 3, 4, 5 days, and it's going to be lost completely. And that probably will mean that this bridgehead on the eastern side of the channel or canal is gonna get lost. So that's actually more worse situation, because this bridgehead prevented Russia's troops from being able to actually cross this canal here south of Chasiv. So in a way, it kind of stalled the whole attack. Now, if or I would say, if when this gonna get lost, this bridgehead, this will actually open up many more opportunities for Russian troops. So I would say, out of all of the situation, losing this bridgehead is really quite a big negative development for Ukraine. I'm not saying it happened, but this is where the likelihood of where the situation is moving from here. Now let's look at the situation on the central Donbass front line. So this is, as I mentioned before, the most dangerous situation for Ukraine. Simply, let's say, Ukrainian defensive lines are um, collapsing, and at accelerating pace, which really means that there could be quite a major breakthrough by Russian troops. The biggest question is really if Russian command has reserves to exploit it and to continue this pressure and push. And that's really the biggest question. From what I understand, that Russian command is bringing some of the units from the front line along the Dnipro River. So, for example, a 110th brigade is being moved into this area to help with pushing, because the way the situation for Russian command is that they need to hold the sides of this sort of moving more and more towards the West salient. So supporting the flanks requires troops as well, requires effort. So they need, it kind of starts to consume ever larger amount of Russian troops, and so they're basically, Russian command is facing I wouldn't say dilemma or two passes. This whole attack will naturally stop because the flanks are becoming more and more stretched, and you need to support more and more of those, and so you naturally, then you don't have enough resources to continue your spear of your attack, which is, as you can see, it's along this railroad, and so its naturally will stall because there's going to be enough resources, because they will be expended on holding the flanks, or there will be major collapse of Ukrainian defensive line, where there will be flood of Russian troops into Ukrainian rear, which will create much larger strategic level collapse. So this is where the situation is developing. It's still unclear where it will end up, but it's very clear that Russian command is bringing reinforcements and troops, and even pulling troops from other sectors of the front line, implying that they're gambling that this collapse is somewhere close or somewhere near. Remains to be seen, but it's definitely sort of, how to say, understandable gamble. Let's put it this way. It doesn't mean that it's going to be successful, but there's quite a bit of signs that it might be successful. And in terms of the pass, more likely that Russian troops will go south and basically collapse Ukrainian front line all the way to Krasnohorivka, essentially, if this happens, obviously, because to the west of this attack, there is last sort of towns, last urban area, which is always going to be slowed down. You cannot advance fast, and so Russian command was likely to will try to avoid it, and then the pass is then to the south, and or basically move west of Selidova, because it's another town that's going to be another sort of problem that will stall the whole advance for months. So we'll see what's going to happen. As I stated, the biggest question if Russian command will pull enough reserves to really sort of make the final push to really create strategic problem for Ukrainian forces here. This is previous, as you can see. There is quite there's non-stop movements here, and it's at accelerating pace. This is a bigger picture, and Russian troops are still finishing with Krasnohorivka, which is south of where I showed. It's, as I stated before, essentially lost. Ukrainian forces really have some, let's say, outskirts, northwestern outskirts of Krasnohorivka. Essentially, it is lost, as I mentioned before. Then Russian troops continuing their pressure west of Novomikhailivka, but nothing tremendously sort of earth-shattering here. The whole sort of another point is that Russian command understand that they cannot capture Vuhledar in a frontal attack, and it's cornerstone of Ukrainian defenses that's really holding this whole angle. And so the idea potentially even that this attack that's happening here around in this Cheretina area might turn south to basically collapse this whole front line. Or it might be much more limited, right? Just collapse something very small in this area. So remains to be seen, but situation is clearly extremely negative for Ukraine. And this obviously forces Ukrainian president to seek negotiations with Russia, but as I said before, Russia refuses for obvious reasons, because they don't see a need in that, which I think is surprise for Ukrainian president, because apparently he was thinking that the world, I would say, rotates around him, and whenever he decides that he wants to stop, things will stop automatically. Now let's check the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are more or less quiet. Russian troops slowly moving north of Rozhaine. Some small successes around Robotina area. Nothing really major, just small typical movements here. And then last section of the front line along the Dnipro River. So this is where Russian command is allegedly pulling resources. It's not 100% confirmed, but I would say it's very likely. So based on some information, then they pulled a 110th brigade, so they might be that other units are being pulled from here as well. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye bye.